December 10, 1941. Clark Field, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata watched through his cockpit canopy as the massive four-engine American bomber burned on the tarmac below. His Mitsubishi A6M0 had just completed its fourth strafing run over Clark Field, and the destruction was total. 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses, America's supposedly invincible heavy bombers, sat destroyed or burning where Japanese bombs had caught them on the ground. Shibata's squadron had trained for this moment, but they hadn't expected it to be this easy. The bombers were huge, slow, and had been sitting in neat rows like targets at a practice range. Not a single B-17 had made it airborne to defend itself. Back at the carrier Akagi that evening, Shibata and his fellow pilots shared sake and laughed at the American Flying Fortress. The name itself seemed absurd now. What kind of fortress burns on the ground without firing a shot? "The Americans send us elephants to fight our hummingbirds," Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai remarked, using the metaphor that would become common among Zero pilots. Big, slow, clumsy, easy targets. The technical intelligence reports confirmed their contempt. The B-17 cruised at 180 miles per hour. The Zero could reach 350 miles per hour. The Fortress weighed 27 tons loaded. A Zero weighed 1.6 tons. In a turning fight, the comparison was laughable. A Zero could complete 3 full circles, while a B-17 completed 1 lumbering turn. What none of these pilots knew that December night, what they couldn't have predicted, was that within 18 months they would come to fear and respect the B-17 more than any other Allied aircraft. They would watch in disbelief as flying fortresses absorbed damage that should have obliterated them and continued flying. They would count their cannon shells hitting bomber fuselages without bringing them down. They would learn the hard way that American engineering had created something their combat philosophy had never anticipated, a machine that won through endurance rather than agility, through strength rather than speed. The laughter of December 1941 would become the silence of awe by mid-1943, when Japanese pilots would refuse to attack lone B-17s, having learned that the slow elephants had teeth and a will to survive that defied every principle of aerial combat they'd been taught. To understand why Japanese pilots initially dismissed the B-17, you must understand the combat philosophy that had made Japan's naval aviation the finest in the world by 1941. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized the samurai concept of kessen kantai, decisive battle through superior skill. Their aircraft were designed accordingly. The A6M0 was a manifestation of this philosophy, incredibly maneuverable, able to outclimb and outturn any opponent, flown by pilots who trained for years to master complex aerobatics. But this performance came with brutal compromises. The Zero lacked armor plating to protect the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single incendiary bullet could turn it into a fireball. It carried only 60 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition and 7,000 rounds of 7.7mm machine gun ammunition, forcing pilots to make every shot count. The design philosophy was clear. Japanese pilots expected to win through superior skill before the enemy could inflict serious damage. Armor was unnecessary weight. Fire suppression was unnecessary if you shot down the enemy first. Ammunition conservation was a virtue. The B-17 represented the opposite philosophy entirely. American engineers had designed a bomber to survive, not to dogfight. Every design choice emphasized endurance over elegance. Armor plating, protected crew positions, particularly the cockpit and gun positions. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without catastrophic failure. redundant systems. 4 engines when 2 could technically do the job, dual control systems, multiple fuel pumps, heavy defensive armament, 13.5 caliber machine guns covering every approach angle, structural over-engineering, frame built to withstand combat damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. When Japanese intelligence analyzed the B-17's specifications in late 1941, they saw a machine that violated every principle of efficient aircraft design. It was overweight, undergunned for its size, and slower than fighters half its age. The Fortress weighed 50% more than it needed to carry its bomb load. It featured redundancies that Japanese engineers considered wasteful. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's finest aerial tacticians and a planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, summarized the Japanese assessment. The American heavy bomber represents brute force engineering without elegance. It is powerful but crude, strong but slow, heavily armed but unable to maneuver. Our Zeros will find these bombers easy targets in the air, as we found them on the ground. This assessment was about to collide with reality in the skies over the Pacific.
On December 10, 1941, the same day Shibata's squadron destroyed B-17s on the ground, Captain Colin Kelly piloted one of the few flying fortresses that had escaped destruction. His mission was to attack Japanese invasion forces off Luzon. Kelly's B-17 found the Japanese cruiser Ashigara and made a bombing approach from 22,000 feet. The bombs missed. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships would prove nearly impossible throughout the war. But the attack drew a response that would provide the first real data on B-17's survivability. 6 A-6M Zeros from the carrier Ryujo, led by Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, intercepted Kelly's bomber. Suganami's after-action report reveals the first hints of what Japanese pilots were about to discover. December 10, 1941, 14:30 hours. Intercepted American 4-engine bomber. Made initial pass from above and behind, standard attack position. Observed strikes on fuselage and wings. Bomber did not alter course. Made second pass, concentrating fire on right inboard engine. Engine began smoking, but bomber maintained altitude. Third pass from head-on, position most dangerous due to bomber's forward guns firing at our aircraft. Achieved multiple strikes on the nose section. Bomber finally began descending but maintained controlled flight. Lost contact when bomber entered cloud cover at 8,000 feet. Estimate bomber destroyed or forced to ditch. Kelly's bomber did crash and Kelly was killed. He would receive a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross. But what Suganami's report reveals is more significant. A B-17 had absorbed 3 separate attack runs by 6 of Japan's finest fighters flying the world's most maneuverable fighter and had maintained controlled flight long enough to escape. This was not supposed to be possible. The engagement data recorded by Japanese squadrons in December 1941 began showing a pattern that troubled Japanese air commanders. Average cannon shells required to down B-17, 89 rounds, versus 12 rounds for typical Allied fighter. Average time to down B-17, 4.7 minutes of sustained attack versus 30 seconds for Allied fighter. 0 losses during B-17 attacks, 3 destroyed, 11 damaged from bomber defensive fire. That last statistic was particularly disturbing. Japanese losses in fighter versus fighter combat were minimal. The Zero superiority was absolute, but attacking bombers was proving costly. The B-17's 13.5 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, created a defensive sphere that forced Japanese fighters to attack through curtains of heavy machine gun fire. Lieutenant Sakai, who would become Japan's 3rd highest scoring ace, described his first engagement with a B-17 in his post-war memoirs. I attacked a flying fortress on December 22, 1941 over Mindanao. I was confident. I had already shot down 4 American fighters, but the fortress was different. I could see my cannon shells hitting the fuselage, saw the flashes of impact, but the bomber flew on. I made 7 attack passes, expending all my cannon ammunition and most of my machine gun ammunition. The fortress was still flying when I had to break off due to fuel concerns. I later learned it returned to its base and landed successfully. This was not combat as we understood it.
By early 1943, Japanese pilots had learned to take B-17s seriously. But they still believed coordinated attacks by skilled Zero pilots could reliably down the bombers. What happened on the morning of February 1, 1943, would challenge that confidence completely. 8 B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group departed their base near Biskra, Algeria, for a raid on the German-controlled port of Tunis. One bomber, B-17F All-American, piloted by Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, flew as a spare, a replacement for a bomber with engine trouble. The bombing run succeeded, and the formation turned for home. That's when the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters struck. In the chaos of combat over the Mediterranean, one German fighter collided with All-American in an impact that should have destroyed both aircraft instantly. The Bf-109 disintegrated. Its wing sliced through All-American's fuselage like a guillotine blade, cutting through the structure just behind the radio room. The bomber's tail section, with tail gunner Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolis still inside, was connected to the rest of the aircraft by only 2 narrow strips of fuselage skin and the control cables running along the floor. The physics should have been impossible. The bomber's rear fuselage, weighing several tons, was held on by structural elements thinner than a man's wrist. The aerodynamic forces at 185 miles per hour should have ripped it free immediately. But it didn't separate. The 2 thin strips of aluminum skin held. The control cables, designed to move control surfaces, somehow bore loads they were never designed to carry. And Lieutenant Bragg, feeling his aircraft shudder but not understanding the damage, continued flying toward base. The tail gunner, Sarpolis, could see blue sky through the gash in the fuselage. He could reach outside and touch the slipstream. The bomber's tail was flexing independently of the fuselage with every gust of wind. Yet the cables held, and the aircraft remained controllable. Bragg flew All-American for another 90 miles, maintaining formation with the squadron. Only when other crews radioed descriptions of the damage did he understand what had happened. The bomber's left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone. The right stabilizer was shredded. The vertical fin was damaged. 2 engines were dead. The fuselage was severed. The aircraft should have been a falling debris field over Tunisia. Instead, it was flying in formation with minor control difficulties. Bragg brought All-American to a successful emergency landing. The tail section sagged to the runway on touchdown, but held together long enough for the crew to evacuate. All 10 men survived without serious injury. The photographs of All-American were distributed through U.S. military intelligence channels and eventually reached Japanese hands through neutral sources. Japanese pilots who saw the images struggled to comprehend what they showed. How does an aircraft survive with its fuselage cut nearly through? What kind of engineering produces a machine that continues flying with damage that would have atomized any Japanese aircraft?
If All-American challenged Japanese understanding of structural resilience, the engagement on June 16, 1943, would demonstrate something even more terrifying: a B-17 that fought back like a battleship. B-17E, serial number 412666, nicknamed Old 666 due to superstitions surrounding its tail number, had a notorious reputation. Crews believed it was cursed. The bomber returned from missions with catastrophic battle damage repeatedly, earning a reputation as a magnet for enemy fire. No regular crew would fly it. Eventually, it was towed to the back of the airfield at Port Moresby, awaiting cannibalization for spare parts. That's where Captain J. Zemer found it. Zemer commanded a reconnaissance crew, the Eager Beavers, who needed an aircraft for deep penetration photo missions. Old 666 was available, and Zemer saw potential where others saw a death trap. Over several weeks, Zemer's crew modified Old 666, illegally, without official authorization. They stripped out unnecessary equipment to reduce weight. They replaced the 4 worn engines with newer, more powerful models. And most significantly, they added guns. Lots of guns. Standard B-17E configuration, 12 machine guns. Old 666 final configuration, 19 machine guns. They mounted twin .50 caliber guns in both waist positions. They added twin .5 cals in the radio room. They installed a fixed forward-firing gun controllable from the pilot's position. They added extra ammunition storage throughout the aircraft. Old 666 became the most heavily armed bomber in the Pacific theater. On June 16th, Zemer volunteered Old 666 for a solo photo reconnaissance mission over Bougainville Island, deep in Japanese-controlled territory. Intelligence reports indicated the area was lightly defended. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. As Old 666 began its photo reconnaissance run at 25,000 feet, 17 A6M0s scrambled from Buin Airfield on Bougainville's southern coast. The Japanese pilots had been specifically trained to intercept B-17s using coordinated attack tactics developed over 18 months of combat experience. Lieutenant Mitsugu Kofukuda led the intercepting force. His pilots knew how to bring down fortresses, concentrate fire on the vulnerable nose section in coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, preventing the bomber from evading any single attacker without exposing itself to others. The first attack wave struck at 25,000 feet, 5 zeros in a coordinated formation, 2 approaching from behind, 3 spread across the front. Kofukuda's tactical planning was flawless. The positioning prevented Zemer from executing his usual defensive tactic of turning inside the attack angle to give his dorsal and tail gunners clear shots. But Zemer's modifications meant the tactics designed to exploit B-17 vulnerabilities encountered a fortress that didn't match Japanese intelligence estimates. As the 3 frontal Zeros lined up their attack run, the position they expected to find a bomber nose equipped with only 2 machine guns, they encountered the surprise Zemer had built. The fixed nose gun position controlled from the pilot's seat, supplemented by the bombardier's twin .50 cals. Zemer opened fire at 1,000 meters. The lead Zero, flown by Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Yoshio Oki, took hits in the engine cowling and pulled away trailing smoke. The second Zero pressed the attack, but flew into concentrated fire from Bombardier 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski's twin guns. Its wing root exploded, a critical structural hit, and the fighter snapped into an uncontrolled roll.
The third frontal attacker, committed to his attack run, achieved what seemed like a kill shot. 2 20mm cannon shells struck Old 666's cockpit area. One shell entered the nose section, detonating and sending shrapnel through the bombardier's compartment. Sarnowski was thrown backward by the blast, bleeding from multiple wounds. Zemer took shrapnel in both arms and legs. The cockpit filled with smoke and the smell of explosives. The Zero pilot who achieved the hit expected to see the bomber enter an uncontrolled dive, standard result when a B-17's cockpit takes direct cannon fire. Instead, Old 666 held course. Zemer,
despite excruciating pain and blood pooling around his feet, maintained level flight. Sarnosky, badly wounded, crawled back to his gun position as more Zeros lined up for attack. What followed was 40 minutes of continuous aerial combat that entered Japanese military aviation history as one of the most intense bomber defense actions of the war. Wave after wave of Zeros attacked. Old 666's gunners maintained disciplined fire, creating interlocking fields that forced Japanese pilots to fly through curtains of 50 caliber rounds to press their attacks. The bomber's extra guns meant there were no blind spots. Every approach angle encountered multiple defensive positions. 3 more Zeros were damaged severely enough to break off the attack. One fighter, attempting a tail attack, flew into sustained fire from the twin tail guns and exploded spectacularly, a lucky hit to its unprotected fuel tanks. Another Zero, pressing a beam attack despite taking hits, had its tail structure shot away and spiraled into the ocean below. Sarnosky, despite mortal wounds, continued firing until he collapsed at his guns. He would die during the return flight, but not before downing at least 2 more Zeros. The attack reached its crescendo when the remaining Zeros, low on ammunition and fuel, made coordinated firing passes before breaking off. Old 666 had absorbed 5 direct 20mm cannon shell hits, 187 7.7mm machine gun bullet holes, damage to 3 engines, severed oxygen lines, forcing crew to descend to 10,000 feet, multiple control cable hits, and fuselage penetration in 43 separate locations. Yet Old 666 remained airborne and controllable. The Japanese pilots who survived the engagement filed after-action reports that revealed their shock. Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Suehiro Yamamoto, whose Zero had been damaged during the attack, wrote, "We attacked a lone B-17 with superior numbers and coordination. Our tactics were correct. Our marksmanship was accurate. We achieved many hits, yet the fortress survived and destroyed or damaged 6 of our aircraft. I do not understand how this is possible." Zemer, barely conscious from blood loss, guided Old 666 back to base at Dobodura, New Guinea. Ground crews who saw the aircraft arrive declared Zemer dead. No one could survive that amount of blood loss. But Zemer regained consciousness hours later and would survive his wounds. Both Zemer and Sarnosky received the Medal of Honor. The remaining 7 crew members received the Distinguished Service Cross. It was the most decorated single aircrew mission of World War II. But the real significance wasn't the medals. It was what Old 666 demonstrated. A properly defended B-17 flown by a skilled crew was not an easy target even when outnumbered 17-1 by the finest fighter pilots in the Japanese military.
Japanese engineers studying combat reports struggled to understand how B-17s survived damage that should have been catastrophic. The mathematics of structural failure said these aircraft should be debris fields. The reality said otherwise. The secret was redundancy and over-engineering that Japanese design philosophy considered wasteful. Wing structure. The B-17's wing used a multi-spar design with 3 main structural members running the span. Japanese bombers typically used single-spar designs. When flak or cannon fire damaged a B-17 wing spar, the remaining spars continued carrying the load. Japanese wings, with only 1 main spar, failed catastrophically from equivalent damage. Fuselage construction. The B-17's fuselage featured ring frame construction every 20 inches with heavy longitudinal stringers. This created a structure where damage to one section didn't propagate. Japanese bombers used ring frames spaced 30 to 40 inches apart with lighter stringers, more material efficient but less damage resistant. Control systems.
The B-17 featured dual control cables for all primary flight surfaces, routed through separate sections of the aircraft. Many Japanese bombers used single cable runs. One severed cable meant loss of control on Japanese aircraft. On the B-17, the backup system continued functioning. Fuel system. Each of the B-17's fuel tanks was divided into multiple cells with self-sealing material between layers. A hit that would have explosively ignited a Japanese fuel tank was contained to a single cell in the B-17 system. The self-sealing material, rubber and plastics designed to swell when exposed to fuel, automatically plugged holes from gunfire. Engine mounting. B-17 engines were mounted on structural beams designed to withstand not just normal flight loads, but the asymmetric thrust of three dead engines. The mounts included firewall protections that prevented engine fires from spreading to fuel lines and wing structures. Japanese bombers lacked this level of fire protection engineering. The cumulative effect of these design choices was an aircraft that could lose 40% of its structural elements and remain flyable. Japanese aircraft, optimized for performance and maneuverability, typically became uncontrollable with 15 to 20% structural damage. American engineers had made a deliberate choice: accept reduced performance to achieve survival. Japanese engineers had made the opposite choice: maximize performance by eliminating unnecessary weight. In the crucible of combat, the American approach proved superior.
By March 1943, Japanese forces understood that B-17s were tougher than anticipated, but they still believed coordinated fighter attack tactics could reliably stop bomber formations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea would demonstrate they were wrong about that, too. On March 2, 1943, Japanese forces attempted to reinforce their garrison at Lae, New Guinea, with a convoy of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers carrying 6,900 soldiers. Allied intelligence detected the convoy, and 5th Air Force committed everything available to stop it: B-17s, B-25s, A-20s, and Australian Beaufighters. On March 3, 13 B-17s of the 64th Bombardment Squadron found the convoy and bombed from 7,000 feet, much lower than usual B-17 doctrine recommended. The lower altitude improved bombing accuracy, but exposed the bombers to intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. Approximately 30 A-6M Zeros scrambled from Lae to intercept the bombers. Japanese pilots expected the lower altitude would make B-17s more vulnerable. At 7,000 feet, Zeros could easily reach the bombers and had more room to maneuver for attack runs. The air battle that developed demonstrated how wrong these assumptions were. The B-17 formations maintained tight defensive boxes. Each bomber's guns covered neighboring aircraft, creating overlapping fields of fire. Japanese pilots found that attacking any single bomber meant flying through defensive fire from 3 to 5 different aircraft simultaneously. The Zero pilots tried head-on attacks, the tactic that had proven most effective against isolated B-17s. But in formation, head-on attacks meant flying through a wall of .50 caliber fire from multiple bombers. 3 Zeros were shot down in the first wave of head-on attacks. They tried beam attacks from 90 degrees, the approach angle with shortest exposure time. The B-17's waist gunners and ball turret gunners created interlocking fields of fire that caught Zeros in crossfire. 2 more fighters went down. They tried slashing attacks from above, diving through the formation at high speed to minimize exposure. But the B-17's top turrets tracked them through the dive, and the brief moments of exposure were enough. Several Zeros took damage, forcing them to break off. After 45 minutes of intense combat, the Japanese had shot down 1 B-17, breaking up in midair after catastrophic damage. but they had lost 7 Zeros destroyed and 3 damaged. The exchange ratio was appalling: 7 elite fighters and pilots for 1 bomber. Worse, the convoy was devastated. The B-17's bombing from 7,000 feet was far more accurate than usual. Combined with follow-up attacks by B-25s using skip bombing tactics and strafing runs by Beaufighters, the Japanese lost all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Of the 6,900 soldiers embarked, fewer than 1,200 reached land. It was one of the most complete destruction of a military convoy in naval history. Japanese after-action analysis of the Bismarck Sea engagement concluded that their fighter tactics against B-17 formations needed fundamental revision. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, analyzing combat reports, wrote, "Our fighters achieved numerous hits on enemy bombers, observed damage inflicted, yet the formations maintained cohesion and continued attacks. The resilience of American heavy bombers exceeds our previous estimates by factor of 3 to 4. New tactics required urgently. Current approach results in unacceptable fighter losses for insufficient bomber kills." The problem was that there were no new tactics that would work. The B-17 in formation was essentially an aerial fortress, exactly what its name implied. Japanese fighters could damage them, could occasionally shoot one down, but couldn't reliably stop them without accepting prohibitive losses.
Throughout 1943 and into 1944, individual B-17s returned to base with damage that Japanese pilots initially refused to believe when they heard reports. These stories circulated through Japanese air units, building a mythology around the American bomber's invincibility. Memphis Belle, May 17, 1943 mission to Lorient, France, took 8 flak hits, including one that punched through the fuselage and exited through the roof, missing crew members by inches, landed successfully with 3 engines, and completed its 25th mission, becoming the first B-17 to finish a combat tour. 909, various missions 1943-1945, completed 140 combat missions, more than any other European theater B-17, accumulated damage from over 500 flak hits and 20 fighter attacks. Ground crews counted 21 different occasions when damage should have been catastrophic, but wasn't. Knockout Dropper survived 75 missions with the 303rd Bomb Group. On one mission over Germany, took flak that destroyed the entire bombardier compartment, killed the bombardier, but left the nose structure intact enough to maintain pressurization. The pilot was able to continue the mission and return to base. Snake Hips, August 24, 1944, mission to Mersburg oil refineries. 3 bombs exploded prematurely on the starboard wing, blowing off a 15-foot section of wing, including 1 engine. The bomber didn't roll over. The remaining wing structure and 3 engines provided enough lift asymmetry to maintain controlled flight. Pilot 2nd Lieutenant John Bosco flew 400 miles back to England and landed successfully with the massive wing damage visible from miles away. These stories reached Japanese intelligence through various channels: neutral observers, captured airmen's testimonies, photographic evidence. Each story reinforced the growing Japanese belief that the B-17 possessed almost supernatural durability. Lieutenant Yasuhiro Kuroe, a Zero pilot who survived multiple engagements with B-17s, described the psychological impact. "We learned to fear the fortress not because it was fast or maneuverable. It was neither. We feared it because it refused to die. You could see your shells exploding against the fuselage, count your hits, watch pieces of the bomber fall away, and yet it continued flying." After several missions attacking these bombers, pilots began to believe the Americans had invented aircraft that could not be destroyed. This belief was dangerous because it created hesitation in attack. That hesitation showed in Japanese combat effectiveness statistics. In early 1943, Japanese fighters could expect to down 1 B-17 for every 15 to 20 attack runs. By late 1943, the ratio had degraded to 1 B-17 for every 35 to 40 attack runs. Japanese pilot skill hadn't diminished. The bombers hadn't become more resistant to damage. What changed was pilot psychology.
The B-17's remarkable survival capability came with significant operational costs that Japanese analysis sometimes missed in focusing on combat resilience. Weight penalty. A fully equipped B-17G weighed 36,000 pounds empty versus 15,000 pounds for a fully armed Zero. The structural reinforcement, armor, and redundant systems added 8,000 to 10,000 pounds compared to a minimum weight design. This translated to reduced speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. Cost penalty. A B-17 cost $238,000 in 1944 dollars, equivalent to $4.2 million in 2025. A Zero cost approximately $35,000, equivalent to $625,000 in 2025. For the cost of one B-17, Japan could have manufactured 7 Zeros. Maintenance burden. The B-17 required 240 man-hours of maintenance per flight hour. The Zero required 85 man-hours. The complexity that made B-17s survivable also made them maintenance-intensive. Production complexity. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega together built 12,731 B-17s from 1941 to 1945, averaging 3,183 annually at peak production. Japan built 10,815 Zeros from 1940 to 1945, averaging 2,163 annually. Given that a Zero required 1/4 the materials and 1/3 the labor of a B-17, Japanese production efficiency was actually lower than American efficiency, even accounting for industrial capacity differences. The Japanese military understood these trade-offs intellectually, but never internalized their strategic implications. Japanese doctrine assumed quality would triumph over quantity, that superior pilots in superior maneuvering aircraft would defeat numerically superior opponents through skill and aggression. This worked brilliantly in 1941 to 1942, when Japan enjoyed qualitative and quantitative advantages. But by 1943, the equation had shifted. American industry was producing B-17s faster than Japan could train pilots to replace losses. The bombers absorbed damage and returned to service. The Zeros and their pilots, when hit, were usually lost permanently. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this reality. In April 1943, shortly before his death, he wrote to a colleague, "The Americans have solved the attrition equation that kills all air forces. They have built aircraft that survive long enough to complete many missions, reducing replacement demand, while our aircraft, more capable in single combat, are lost at rates that exceed our ability to replace them. We are winning tactically while losing strategically."
By 1944, Japanese air units in the Pacific had developed standard operating procedures for B-17 encounters that reflected their evolved understanding. Tactical Directive 1744, Japanese Naval Air Force, February 1944. Attacks on American B-17 formations should be conducted only with numerical superiority, minimum 3-1. Solo attacks on B-17 formations are forbidden except in emergency circumstances. Pilots are reminded that damaging a B-17 is not equivalent to destroying it. Attacks should be pressed until visual confirmation of catastrophic damage, wing separation, uncontrolled dive, fire not contained. Breaking off attack after observing hits is inadequate. The directive acknowledged what Japanese pilots had learned painfully. Hitting a B-17 was easy. Killing it was hard. Lieutenant Sadao Yamaguchi, a fighter squadron commander based at Rabual, wrote a tactical analysis in March 1944 that circulated through Japanese fighter units. The B-17 represents a philosophy of aerial warfare our doctrine does not address. We train to destroy enemy aircraft through superior maneuver and precision gunnery. The B-17 is designed to absorb our gunnery and continue functioning. It defeats us not through countermaneuver, but through endurance. Our cannon shells damage it, our machine gun fire wounds it, yet it completes its mission and returns to base. I have observed B-17s with the following damage still flying under control. One engine completely severed from wing, remaining 3 engines operating. Horizontal stabilizer 60% destroyed by cannon fire, aircraft maintaining altitude. Fuselage hold in 40-plus locations, crew visible through holes, aircraft still bombing assigned target. Both waist gunner positions destroyed, gunners killed, remaining defensive fire continuing. Each of these damage levels would destroy any Japanese bomber immediately. The B-17 absorbs this damage as operational cost rather than catastrophic failure. We have no aircraft that can survive comparable punishment. This represents American industrial philosophy we cannot match. They build survival into design, accepting performance penalties we would never accept. By 1944, veteran Japanese pilots approached B-17 formations with caution bordering on reluctance. Combat reports show Japanese fighters would shadow formations without attacking, waiting for opportunities to isolate damaged bombers from the protective fire of the formation. Direct attacks on intact formations became increasingly rare. This operational hesitation had strategic consequences. B-17s operating in the Pacific, while never as numerous as in Europe, operated with relative impunity compared to 1942. Reconnaissance missions that would have been suicide in 1942 became routine by late 1944. The bombers that Japanese pilots had laughed at in December 1941 now owned the skies over Japanese-held territory. After Japan's surrender, American intelligence teams interviewed surviving Japanese pilots and commanders about their experiences fighting various Allied aircraft. The assessments of the B-17 revealed how completely Japanese opinion had shifted from the mockery of 1941. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had dismissed the B-17 as crude and vulnerable in 1941, provided this post-war assessment. We understood the B-17's technical specifications from the beginning. What we failed to understand was the philosophy behind those specifications. Japanese engineering prioritized performance, speed, maneuver, climb rate. American engineering prioritized survival, redundancy, armor, structural strength. In air-to-air combat, performance wins. In strategic bombing campaigns, survival wins. We optimized for the wrong variable. The B-17 taught us that in modern warfare, the ability to absorb damage and continue operations can be more valuable than the ability to avoid damage through superior performance. This was a lesson we learned too late. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third highest-scoring ace with 64 confirmed kills, was even more direct in his post-war memoir, Samurai. Of all the Allied aircraft I fought, the B-17 was the most difficult to destroy. Not the most dangerous in dogfight, that was the F-6F Hellcat. Not the fastest, that was the P-38 Lightning. Not the most maneuverable, that was the Spitfire. But the hardest to kill. You could shoot it full of holes and it kept flying. You could kill half the crew and it kept bombing. You could destroy 2 engines and it kept formation. I personally attacked B-17s on 14 occasions. I achieved confirmed hits on 11 of those occasions. I destroyed 0 B-17s. This tells you everything about why we lost the air war. We could hit them, but not kill them. They built machines that refused to die. The most revealing assessment came from Commander Yoshio Shiga, a fighter group commander who had flown at Pearl Harbor and survived the entire war. In 1946, during his interrogation by American technical intelligence, he provided this analysis. When we first saw the B-17, we thought you Americans had made a mistake. The aircraft was too heavy, too slow, too expensive. We thought our Zeros would shoot them down easily. This assessment was correct for isolated bombers. We could destroy lone B-17s with acceptable losses. But B-17s never operated alone. They operated in formations where each aircraft protected the others.
and the formations kept coming. You would shoot one down and two more would arrive the next day. You would damage three and they would be repaired and flying again the next week. The B-17 represented something we did not understand until too late: industrial sustainability. You built bombers that could take damage and return to service repeatedly. We built fighters that could destroy bombers but could not be replaced when destroyed themselves. Your philosophy was the correct one for total war. Ours was the philosophy for limited war. We were fighting total war with limited war philosophy. This is why we lost.
The B-17 Flying Fortress did more than survive combat. It fundamentally changed how air forces designed strategic bombers for the next 40 years. Strategic bombing doctrine. The B-17 proved daylight precision bombing was possible, despite enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. This validated the pre-war American doctrine that Germany and Japan had considered suicidal. Post-war bomber design for decades emphasized survivability over speed. Defensive armament philosophy. The B-17's heavily armed approach influenced the B-29, B-50, B-36, and early jet bombers. Soviet T-4, T-16, and T-95 bombers copied the concept of aircraft bristling with defensive guns. Only with the advent of surface-to-air missiles did this philosophy change. Structural redundancy standards. Commercial aviation adopted B-17 structural philosophy. Modern airliners use redundant control systems, multiple spars in wing construction, and fail-safe structures derived directly from B-17 engineering. The reason commercial aviation is extraordinarily safe today traces partly to lessons learned from keeping B-17s flying with combat damage. Crew survivability focus. The B-17's armor protection philosophy influenced post-war military aircraft design. The concept that crew survivability was worth performance penalties became standard in American military aviation doctrine. The Japanese learned these lessons but implemented them differently. Post-war Japanese aircraft industry, rebuilding under American influence, adopted American safety and redundancy philosophies. The Japan that had built Zeros with no armor in 1940 was building commercial aircraft with extensive safety systems by 1970. The transformation was complete. When the war ended, statisticians compiled comprehensive data on B-17 combat performance in the Pacific Theater. The numbers reveal why Japanese pilots' opinions had transformed so completely. Total B-17 sorties flown in Pacific Theater, 34,127. Total B-17s lost to all causes, 458. Loss rate, 1.34%, compared to 4.7% in European theater. Breakdown of losses. Enemy fighters, 112 aircraft, 24%. Anti-aircraft fire, 87 aircraft, 19%. Operational accidents, 143 aircraft, 31%. Weather and other, 116 aircraft, 26%. Average missions before loss, 74 missions. Average damage repair time, 3.2 days. Percentage returning with battle damage, 67%. Combat effectiveness. Japanese fighters destroyed in B-17 engagements, 542 confirmed. Exchange ratio, 4.8 Japanese fighters per B-17 lost to fighters. Bomb tonnage delivered, 223,847 tons. Cost per ton delivered, $1,064 per ton. Extremely efficient for strategic bombing. The statistics that mattered most to Japanese commanders. Average 20mm cannon shells required to down B-17, 94 rounds. Japanese Zeros carried only 60 rounds. Average combat time before B-17 forced from formation, 8.4 minutes of continuous attack.
Percentage of B-17s that returned to base despite major damage? 73%. These numbers explain why Japanese pilots went from laughing at the Flying Fortress to respecting it more than any other Allied aircraft. The B-17 could be hit, easily, but hitting it wasn't the same as killing it.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Among the many factors that led to Japanese defeat, atomic bombs, Soviet invasion, naval blockade, island-hopping campaigns, the strategic bombing campaign that the B-17 helped pioneer played a crucial role. The bomber that Japanese pilots had mocked in December 1941 had participated in 34,127 combat missions, delivered 223,847 tons of bombs on Japanese-held territory, and helped strangle Japan's supply lines across the Pacific. It had done this while losing only 112 aircraft to enemy fighters, a loss rate the Japanese couldn't match in reverse. But the B-17's greatest victory wasn't measured in tonnage dropped or missions flown. It was the psychological victory of proving American engineering philosophy superior to Japanese combat philosophy. Japanese pilots and engineers had believed that agility, speed, and precision would defeat brute strength and redundancy. They had built aircraft to win dogfights. Americans built aircraft to survive wars. The difference between those philosophies determined the outcome of the air war. The laugh that Japanese pilots shared in December 1941 when they destroyed B-17s on the ground at Clark Field echoed differently by August 1945. By then, Japanese pilots understood what their commanders had failed to understand in 1941. American engineering represented a philosophy of warfare that valued endurance over elegance, survival over speed, redundancy over refinement. The B-17 Flying Fortress proved that in total war, the machine that keeps flying wins over the machine that flies beautifully. The fortress that Japanese pilots had called a slow elephant had outlasted their graceful hummingbirds. The bomber they thought would be easy prey had proven to be the predator. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, who had laughed at burning B-17s at Clark Field in December 1941, survived the war. In 1947, he visited the United States as part of a technical exchange program. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, he stood before a restored B-17 for several minutes without speaking. When asked his thoughts, he said simply, "We underestimated you. We saw the weight and thought it was weakness. We saw the redundancy and thought it was waste. We saw the armor and thought it was fear. We were wrong about all of it. You built machines that matched your national character, strong enough to take punishment, resilient enough to keep going, and persistent enough to win through endurance rather than brilliance. We built machines that matched our character, precise, elegant, refined. But wars are not won by the most elegant machines. They are won by the machines still flying when the war ends. Your fortresses were still flying. That is why you won." The B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name not through imperviousness. It could be damaged and damaged severely. It earned its name through resilience, the ability to take punishment that would destroy other aircraft and continue flying, continue fighting, continue completing the mission. Japanese pilots learned to respect that resilience. Some learned to fear it. All of them learned that the American bomber they had laughed at in 1941 represented a philosophy of warfare they couldn't defeat. The philosophy that survival is victory, endurance is strength, and the machine still flying with half a wing has already won the battle. The Flying Fortress lived up to its name not by being impervious to attack, but by proving that American engineering could build machines as tough as the crews who flew them. Machines that refused to die, refused to quit, and refused to stop fighting until the war was won. And in the end, that refusal made all the difference.